Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be. You are joining Tiffany Songvalet and I live from vNext conference in Denver, Colorado. We're in day 2.
Who are you?
Oh, I'm Christy Robinson. Thank you. We're on day 2 of the conference and have a number of really good sessions still lined up for the day. If you haven't made a chance or had the opportunity to come out to Denver for this conference, I highly recommend it. It is more than what you're expecting, regardless of what you're expecting from a conference about unified communications and sharing information. But what Tiffany and I are here to do today is to talk about governance. And before we do that, I think we'll do some a little bit more detailed intros. Tiffany?
Okay. So I'm Tiffany Songvalet. I am a group manager with Avanade, and one of the things that I just wanted to start with is to give a special thanks to Eric Marcy and Voltec Solutions for putting together this podcast booth. It's been a fantastic experience throughout the conference to see all the content that's been generated, and we really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. So I am with Avanade, and I have been in SharePoint for, probably 20 years now, if it goes back that far. I think my first thing was back in 2003, so yeah, 20 years exactly. So governance kind of became a thing when Christy and I were working together with a client. We were working together back in 2006 to 2010, I believe, on a project, and that was where her and I got to know one another, and where my foray into using SharePoint for records management began. So that's how I come by it.
Well, I'm Christy Robinson. I own Paint Rock Consulting Services, and that is a small consulting agency that is also a Microsoft partner. I'm focused on the Microsoft 365 stack, previously the Microsoft stack, which included on-prem, and with specialization and expertise in governance and compliance. And like Tiffany mentioned, I've come into the Microsoft ecosystem through beyond just the everyday apps, office apps that people, I think, everywhere use every day, but into SharePoint. I want to say it was in 2001 as part of a multi-state project. And the company that I was working for at the time wanted to be able to share information that was happening in real time across 7 states, but without necessarily having to string, cables and servers from location to location. So we trialed out what was an early precursor to SharePoint, and later the company adopted SharePoint version WSS 3.0. So we've gone through all of the SharePoint growing pains, and I have to say that this modern entity, the SharePoint and Microsoft 365 ecosystem, is just a joy to work with.
Is that what you call it?
A joy to work with.
But that is where governance comes into play, is because when we first started out, I say I've been in IT for so long, I've been here before we knew what we were doing. And so governance always kind of becomes this afterthought. And so I think we're still in a situation when people are doing migrations or trying to stand up something new to try to get them to think about governance first, instead of coming back after everyone has, kind of gone into the Wild West and, just sort of turn something on.
Well, I think that's a good point to start on. Governance can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and I think in some people's minds it might even be a dirty word. It could be a 4-letter word.
Rules!
Or 5-letter word. But I'd like to challenge you, Tiffany, off the top of your head. What comes to mind when you think of the word governance, besides rules?
Yeah, so rules. But I think now that I do more of it, to me it's more about monitoring. Really, actually, monitoring, auditing, creating the guardrails for people. It's about security, authentication, authorization. So what about you? What are some of your words?
Those are probably good phrases. I could copy all of those. I would throw in compliance. I think a lot of people kind of think that compliance and governance are the same thing. They're not really. And I think rules and guardrails are probably pretty good. what I also like to think of is an invisible hand. I don't know who it was. Wasn't there an economist who had a theory about invisible hand economics? I might Google that real quick. Um, but I like to think, done properly, I think compliance and governance can be an invisible hand in your ecosystem that doesn't necessarily put a burden on people and users to have to take much activity. And to Tiffany's point, thinking about that cohesively at the beginning of a project is the best way to consider governance and compliance. It's always going to take longer and cost more and be more painful if you do it after the fact, because there's a lot that you're going to have to be, retrofitting to align with your rollout.
But how do you know what rules you need to put into place until people start breaking them? So one of my frustrating things is how many times when I'm gathering requirements for clients, they keep giving me these what if scenarios, these, what if, and I say, are they doing that now? Well, no. Well, then why are we designing a solution around something they're not even doing now? Like, why are you so worried? So I think that's why governance is such a bad word. It's because people try to make technology do everything to make sure that the user doesn't have to change anything.
That's exactly right. And I guess I would circle back to that word association with governance, and probably the biggest word that gets associated with it is no, the voice of no. These are the boundaries of no. And that's not really the case, or it doesn't have to be. I mean, it is in maybe sloppy rollout or an ill-considered rollout, but it doesn't necessarily have to be made up of pain and pain points.
Yeah.
I like to differentiate between what I call big G governance and little g governance.
Tell me more.
So big G governance I think of as the rules of engagement for your business, your company. Whatever your organization is, you have to file, your business record events, record your business with the state that you're operating in. You have to file taxes. These are the must-dos or must-haves for you to be able to operate your business. That's big G governance. It can also be what the business defines for itself in terms of how it's going to operate in whatever space that it's in. So, financial organization, their governance is going to be somewhat internally defined, but that is also going to be reflective of a regulatory compliance environment. And then small g governance, I think, is kind of this collection of tools and features and utilities across multiple platforms that you can use to help ensure governance or compliance with your company's governance requirements. What do you think?
Well, see, so a lot of what I'm doing now, I mean, yes, I come from a background of compliance. I love compliance. It's one of my favorite things to do. But anymore now, I mean, what I'm really dealing with are things like Teams governance or Power Platform governance that is specific to a technology. So what you're talking about really is governance as a philosophy. And I think for me, where it's real for me is when we're talking about a specific technology. But we've talked about this before. It's why we're here. There's really only like 6 things to governance, right? I mean, it's the same, and you can apply it to an organization. You can apply it to a technology. Governance isn't something that is just for technology. And yet, I think in the circles that we go in, most people think, governance is something special when you're doing it for Teams or something special when you're doing it for Power Platform. It's really not.
Right. Well, and for companies that already do have governance policies or programs in place, then reflecting those in their technology investment should be something done right from the start. When you're investing in a new technology or implementing or updating a technology, perhaps take a checklist consideration and determine, now this new technology that we're rolling out, does it align with our company's information governance principles.
Do we even have a policy for this?
Right.
I mean, that's the first thing. The first thing when you walk in and gather requirements are show me your policies and procedures for this. And how many times do people just not even have that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So if you don't have it documented, you can't build to it or align to it.
That's right.
And that's something that we both work really hard to try to build for organizations is get those requirements or those business needs documented in something resembling a policy that can then be further detailed, either into action plans or implementation plans. And then depending on whatever technology stacks that you're deploying against, configure your compliance on those stacks or on those tools to align with your information governance or your data governance policies.
Okay, so lack of documentation, that's a real challenge for people. What other kinds of governance challenges do you see?
Ooh. Well, in my experience, thinking about the Microsoft 365 stack and going a little bit more detailed into the tactical. So for things like not so much data loss prevention or sensitivity labeling, because those can be automated, but a real pain point for a lot of organizations, especially those that are robust and are subject to robust regulatory requirements or regulated entities. I think they've adopted a mindset that there's an expectation that users within their technology environment are going to have to do something or select something or tag something or flag something.
That's right.
In order for the retention requirements or the retention policies to take effect, or the governance policies if they're a little bit looser than that. And one of the things that's great with ever-changing and ever-evolving tech is that there's so much more that can be automated today than 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
So one of my favorite things is SharePoint syntax, right? The
Yep.
fact that you can go on ahead and automate, you can bring documents into SharePoint, take documents that are already in SharePoint, teach the model how to recognize what the content type is, teach the model how to extract the metadata from them, and then automatically apply the security and retention label. You can apply both of those automatically. So I think that's
Yep.
one of the ways that technology can really help us from a governance perspective. Just like you said, governance has always been one more thing that the user has to do, which is why they hate doing it.
I think a way that that we could maybe make things better for people and businesses is to normalize talking about governance and compliance, so that it's not necessarily this taboo thing or this fuzzy thing that people in the legal department do, or that nobody else really has expertise over. I think with a lot of the financial or the bank failures recently, some of the questions and concerns around NFT winter, potential recession, there are a lot of cases in our recent history in business that might have been prevented or mitigated with a bit more compliance or a bit more governance on those systems and the information that they utilize.
Okay, so what department or what job title should own governance?
Oh, that's a hard one.
Yeah.
So some organizations, like a fintech organization I'm thinking of at the moment, has a director of information governance, but that might be more applicable to larger enterprises. Smaller companies may not have the ability to have a governance officer. So sometimes that falls into the bucket of the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, the Chief Information Officer. Sometimes it falls into the bucket of the IT administration and the legal department.
Mm-hmm.
My recommendation is that the ownership is kind of a hard thing, but stakeholders there should be a stakeholder representation from each line of business within the company. Every organization,
Like a governance committee.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Each line of business, each business function knows the content that they create, what type of regulations it may or may not be required for, hopefully. They are the experts of their information. And somebody from each of those groups should be at the table to help form what a company's governance policy is. That makes it more digestible when it goes through the rounds and iterations. It becomes a policy or a plan or an implementation, and then circles back to something that everyday workers and personnel will see.
So you kind of dodged the question, who should pay for it? Who pays
Oh.
for these governance projects?
That's another good question. So, in my experience, working with small and medium businesses don't put that much of a focus on governance and compliance until they have to. And that's usually the event of, a fine, an
There's an
accident
event,
trigger, or in some cases, there's a new legislation from the FTC, the safeguards rule that comes live in June. That requires like bank adjacent organizations to extend some of the data and consumer protection aspects to their customer data that banks have to do. So if you are a payday lender, for example, or an auto dealership who does financing, entities that you would not normally think of as banks, all of these organizations on June 9th are going to have to demonstrate how they have done basically an assessment and evaluation to attest to them being compliant in protecting consumer financial information. So in small and medium businesses, it's often a trigger like that that will generate the drive for compliance or governance. And then that becomes a budgetary line item that becomes okay because there's a definitive need. I think where it's more proactive is in larger enterprises and especially in regulated industries. I mean, it's a non-starter.
Yeah. So we've written lots of governance plans. What are some of your favorite things to see in a table of contents for a good governance plan?
A stakeholder list.
Roles and responsibilities. If you do
RACI
nothing
chart.
else,
Yeah.
define who is in charge of these things. And we always put it in. We always put in a governance committee. We always recommend it. How many people actually do it, Christy?
Sometimes it'll get blended into like a steering committee,
Yeah,
which is good.
a steering committee is good. Yeah.
Yeah, and it probably, if there is a steering committee, governance probably should be one of the things that they're steering.
So what else do you like to see in a governance plan?
Well, a RACI chart,
Yep.
like roles and responsibilities. The other thing that I like to see is, along those lines, is roles and responsibilities aligned to a job title as opposed to a person.
Yes.
If companies are, really investing in their employees and employees are continually learning and skilling and upskilling, there should be movement within the company as employees, promote to different jobs, take different jobs, or transfer into different departments to expand their own interests. You don't want to necessarily pin something down to a named person, except when you have to, and there are some regulatory requirements that do define that. But wherever possible, if you name the role that's responsible for those particular actions, it also makes it a lot easier to align to with your, in the Microsoft stack, for example, to align with your Azure Active Directory or your dynamic Active Directory, where if you're managing your roles and responsibilities or RBAC security along with your Azure Active Directory, where your people have roles and it's all connected to an org chart behind the scenes, that's a great way to shape those responsibilities so that they stay with the role regardless of who's filling that seat.
That's right, because so many people, governance, like so many things, becomes a part of what they're also doing. And so a lot of times what I like to do, not necessarily in the governance plan, we'll continue to talk about the governance plan, but what I like to do is I like to go into an organization and I like to give them about 5 bullet points. Like, this is the kind of person I'm looking for. I'm looking for somebody who really loves this technology. Right? Not somebody who is just given this role because they're an administrative professional, right? I'm looking for someone who has authority, right? who actually has the authority to tell people that they need to complete this action. Because if I send out an email to someone and nobody has to do what I tell them to do, then my governance fails.
Right.
So I like to give people a list of bullet points to say, okay, these are the types of people who should be in this RACI chart, who should be in these roles and responsibilities. Something else I love to see, and it's usually at the very bottom of the governance document, but I want to see a training plan. How are we training people on governance?
Yep.
And I want to see a communication plan. How are we constantly communicating? So I think people are used to compliance training. They get a lot of those, required trainings that they have to do. But from a governance perspective or a technology perspective, that could be as simple as setting a baseline of what we expect everyone in the organization to know how to do inside of that technology.
Even if it's not technology oriented, I 100% agree with you. I think, I hate to keep using this overused term, but we should normalize governance and the understanding and appreciation for what it is. I've worked with a company recently who had a really robust onboarding process, and that process included how that company manages information, what's considered sensitive or confidential, how that information should be handled, and how their technology does that. So making that an equal piece of importance to somebody's work environment or their work life from day one, I think is very valuable. If it's past day one, that's not a problem. Then building governance and training into your normal learning management system or your employee training, I think is an easy next step. They may already be seeing components of that. For example, in Outlook, if they're seeing a confidential little banner when they mention a certain project or a sensitivity label, they may be seeing some of that in their live environment that they haven't necessarily had training on, or maybe not anything other than an email announcing, hey, you're going to see these labels every once in a while. But just, an annual refresher overview that can be updated based on whatever the technology implementations are going to reflect for that year, I think is a good idea.
Well, and I think, too, when we're talking about training, it's not just, hey, this thing is coming. You're going to have labels inside of your email now. It's, what is sensitive information? What is our definition of that? What is sensitive information? What is confidential information? How are we defining those terms? And I know that that's one of the things that I think is so important, again, in a governance plan. Give me some definitions.
Yep.
Give me some definitions so that I understand what I'm dealing with here.
Yes. That's one of the fun discussions to have, I think, with a new company or startup. Sometimes they may not know, and that's something that you can help an organization figure out. Perhaps an organization is working in a new field, the wild, wild west, let's say, in blockchain or Web3. There's probably a lot yet to be figured out there where governance and compliance exist. So
how do you feel about governance as just turning something off? We would be remiss if we didn't start talking about ChatGPT and the governance around that and how people have just immediately decided we're turning it off. How do you feel?
Oh, I think they're different animals. ChatGPT is a tool akin to what calculators were in the 70s, in my opinion.
Okay.
People are going to have to learn it. It's here. It's, it's out of the box. It's not going away. It's only going to be improved upon and built upon. And I think as a society, we're remiss if we try not to teach that to students or, everyday people, business people. It's already a ubiquitous part of everyday life, even if people aren't seeing it as ChatGPT. So now, where that comes into play in a governance question is if you're utilizing it maybe with Azure AI or Azure OpenAI and leveraging your existing data stores to help formulate what some of those questions or some of those responses might be able to generate. There needs to be some special governance around that.
Well, and in Eric Marcy's session that he just came out of, I really appreciated that one of the things that they brought up was don't be putting your proprietary code into a public channel.
Yes.
Yeah, so...
Yes, I think there was a blog post about that recently. Somebody at Samsung, was it Samsung or Sony, one electronics company, plugged in some proprietary data so that they could get better answers. He is web-based. So, yeah, not a great idea. But I think there are going to be some big governance questions and answers to come down the line as that becomes more ingrained and embedded in our everyday work lives.
So, what's one of the big things that you feel like people misunderstand about governance that you'd really like to change people's minds about it?
That it's hard, that it is uncomfortable, that it is a pain. It doesn't have to be those things. There's enough robustness in those tool sets, that technology, to make that as minimally invasive as possible. And I mean that in terms of, productivity drops, minimally invasive in terms of user interaction, productivity stoppages and starting. There are a lot of ways to work around that with a carefully planned governance implementation.
Love it. So what else do you want to talk about? We got a few more minutes left.
We've got a few
final
more
thoughts?
minutes left, so I'm going to be selfish and plug that I'll be speaking about governance and teams at 1 p.m. Mountain Time here at vNext. Hope people can join us. And what would you like to plug?
Oh gosh, Mark Rackley and I have a podcast, mwmentors.com, www.mwmentors.com, where we talk about just being in the job of IT, and we give tips and tricks using just examples from our own lives. We've started to have some guests now, so we've got like 10 episodes out there now that we're really proud of.
Tell me what the MW means.
Modern work.
Excellent.
Yeah, modern work mentors. So we're really proud of that. And hopefully more to come around syntax from me. I'm going to be starting my own blog and podcast specific to syntax. And certainly this will be one of the very first blog posts, is just how we deal with governance and how technology can enable that governance for us.
Excellent. All right. Well, if there is anything that you'd like to ask us that we didn't cover in our free-form chat here at Comms vNext, feel free and drop a few questions in the comments. We'll be glad to answer any questions you might have. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you later.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Eric.